Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Shoot Festival. We are broadcasting live from Shoot in the East Devon area of outstanding natural beauty. Hello to all of you who are joining us from nearby, our regular followers in the local villages in Devon, around Britain, and indeed around the world. I've seen that we've got people registered from America, from India, and from Europe. So welcome to you all. Devon is looking ever more beautiful at the moment. The sun is shining, we have crocuses, daffodils, snowdrops, cyclamens with their colours coming out. And not only is there the prospect of spring, but also the prospect here of lockdown ending in the now not too distant future. So there's a great sense of joy and relief all about. So it's a great pleasure to be with you all here this evening. And also a very great pleasure to welcome Armand to be speaking to us this evening. Armand is a professor of classics at Jesus College, Oxford, but he's not just a classics don. He's a great polymath and achiever of many things. He is a speaker of many languages, and not just modern languages, but also Latin as well. In fact, one of Armand's initiatives that he's helped pioneer at Oxford is the revival of spoken Latin as a teaching tool, and I've seen some of this take place, and it's a remarkable thing. But Armand, before going into academia, also had a successful career in business, and he was also, and continues to be, a concert musician, a very fine pianist, and a concert cellist. And indeed, there's a wonderful crossover in his work between music and ancient Greek literature and the classics. Armand has done some very practical work in the recreation of ancient Greek music. So he deciphers what it sounded like and then has people recreating the instruments and singing, playing and chanting ancient Greek music. So remarkable, fascinating, practical projects. So these are some of the many things that Armand does. But he's here tonight to talk to us about his recent book, Socrates in Love, which I'm waving in front of the camera. And I should say that if you scroll up the chat box, there is the opportunity to buy it from our local bookshop, Archway. And I see some people joining us from Bridport. Hello, getting it from the Bridport bookshop, which is great as well. Do support your local independents. And thanks for their support to the festival as well. So we're going to talk about sort of Socrates and the background of philosophy. This will hopefully be something that, well, it certainly will be something that any general audience can enjoy and get to understand. We won't be running this one in Latin or ancient Greek, certainly. So just to start out, when the name Socrates comes up nowadays, when people talk about him, he sort of conjures up a sort of fairly mythical image. I mean, he turns up. I mean, you talk about him in the beginning of the book. You say Socrates, and we think of sort of beardy, white beards, a thinker like Rodin. I mean, the one thing that sprung to my well, I suppose slightly more demotic mind was Bill and Ted's Most Excellent Adventure with Socrates being brought back from ancient Athens, sort of telling profound truths to the frat boys. And of course, I mean, people can think of some of his famous maxims, like the unexamined life is not worth living. But I mean, just to start to understand Socrates, and just to sort of recall some things about him, we should start by looking at the context he lived in. So, I mean, we know he was from Athens. Can you tell us a bit about the world in which Socrates lived, and also about some of the intellectual currents in which he grew up? I mean, set the scene for his life for us.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the book, and thanks for your kind introduction. And hello, everyone who has kindly joined us tonight. The background to Socrates, well, there's a cultural background of ancient Athens, an extraordinary, self-governing, independent city-state, a polis as it was known, in which Socrates grew up, having been born very shortly after, the last of the incursions by Persian armies into Greece. So the so-called Persian Wars, probably better known as the Greco-Persian Wars, happened just before he was born. And that made the Greeks very conscious of themselves as different from, distinct from the Eastern world, the so-called barbaroi, they called them because they couldn't understand their language, and rather proud of their military abilities. So Socrates grows up in this world in ancient Athens, which sees itself as having led, fairly or otherwise, the victory over Persia. So there were, of course, other city-states like Sparta, who were very clearly instrumental in fighting back the Persians. But Athens felt that it was the more outgoing of the two. It certainly was in terms of its culture. It was expansionist, and by the middle of the 5th century BC, Athens effectively had an empire around the Greek world, the Aegean world, and was the top dog amongst the Greek cities. So that's the kind of cultural world into which Socrates was born, a world of empire, a world of fighting. And he himself, as a young man, became what's called a hoplite, a heavily armed soldier. So in order to do that, to be a heavily armed infantryman, you had to acquire and maintain a suit of armour, which was an expensive business in the ancient world. You actually had to have a property qualification to allow yourself to become one of the fighters in Athens' battles. So philosophically, the real centre of philosophical thinking was not on the mainland of Greece, not in Athens, but on the other side of the Aegean. So, of course, the Greek world in the 5th century BC wasn't just mainland Greece as we know it today. A lot of the Greeks lived on the coast of what was then known as Ionia. Romans called it Asia Minor. We call it Turkey. The Turkish coast, the western coast of Turkey along the border of the Aegean Sea, was Greek. A lot of Greek cities like Ephesus or Smyrna or Miletus, or islands like Lesbos and Chios and Rhodes and so on. These Greek islands on that side of the Aegean, these Greek cities were the birthplace of Greek thinking. In particular, the city of Miletus, opposite the island of Samos. So, Miletus was the home of philosophers in the 6th century BC, so say a generation or two before Socrates was born. There were philosophers like, names like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes. These are the earliest philosophers that Aristotle, who was later on in the 4th century BC, tells us began the Greek tradition of thought. And those people were essentially interested in what is the cosmos, the universe, made from. Thales said, everything starts with water. That is the basic principle. Anaximenes, Anaximander, these other philosophers said, no, it's air. It's Heraclitus thought that fire and something called the logos, reason, was at the basis of everything in the universe. So they were looking for some prime element. They, of course, in fact, they extended their thought across many different areas, but essentially they're called physical philosophers because they're interested in the physics of the world. What is this world into which we are born? So that was the background that Socrates' intellectual life would have consisted of. And we know from Plato, of course, Socrates wrote nothing, but Plato, his pupil, who knew him only as an old man, wrote a lot about him. And he tells us that Socrates actually listened to some of these philosophers speaking. He met some of them. He met Parmenides, for example, who was one of those so-called pre-Socratic philosophers. And he possibly even was the boy lover of a philosopher called Archelaus, who lived in the early part of the 5th century. And that is, a testimony that is given to us by a pupil of Aristotle, and people have kind of neglected it. But essentially, Aristophanes tells us that Socrates and Archelaus were lovers when Socrates was 17. And it was that kind of little kind of factoid, you might say, from the ancient sources that made me wonder, what was Socrates doing as a young man that ended up with him becoming the philosopher that, as Bijan says, we identify him as, this old bearded man who thinks about ethical matters, not about the physics of the world, but about how we should live.
Lovely. So, well, I should just say to everyone, I hope your sort of the picture of Armand is better than mine, because Armand is rather like a Greek statue in some of the pictures. But I hope you can hear him well, rather like Socrates in a voice. So we'll certainly press on. So, Armand, you've laid out this sort of historical background and intellectual background very nicely. And I mean, you pointed to some of the interesting things that intrigued you about how Socrates, some points of Socrates' life sort of piqued your interest, which other people have perhaps left aside. But again, just let's try and set the scene for Socrates' life himself. I mean, what are the sort of main markers of Socrates' life that, I mean, if we think about the conventional story, this is usually bandied around, but what people usually point to as the main thing in Socrates' life biography, so that we can see
what most people know about Socrates. What most people know about Socrates is that he was put to death. He was put to death by the city of Athens in 399 BC, as it happens, at the age of 70, roughly 69 or 70, and he had to undergo a trial at which he gave his defense speech, and he was adjudged guilty of, in fact, 3 charges: introducing new gods, corrupting the youth, and not believing in the gods of the city. So 2 of the charges were religious, and one of them seems to have been quasi-sexual, corrupting young men, though in fact it seems to hide a political agenda, because the young men that Socrates was said to have corrupted were young aristocratic men, and this was a period of a lot of turbulence at the end of the 5th century, where the Athenian democracy, this unique system of one man, one vote, one citizen, one vote, was operational, and there were various attempts in the course of the last 30 years or so of the 5th century to overthrow the democratic system and replace it with either a broad oligarchy, as it was called, a group of elites who would want to run the city as they thought fit, or actually a narrower oligarchy, in particular at the end of the Peloponnesian War, as it was called, between Athens and its allies, and between Sparta and their allies. You had a group called the 30 tyrants, they're sometimes known as, who briefly set up a tyranny in Athens. And Socrates was seen to be associated with those men who were a junta of tyrants who actually set about massacring their opponents. It was a really unpleasant time, and because Socrates was seen to have taught some of these people, there was a man called Critias, of whom Socrates was the teacher, he was associated with this political movement which was seen to be destructive of Athens' democracy. And remember, Athens had been a democracy since about 507 BC, so 100 years of a democratic constitution, and now you're getting groups of elite men trying to overthrow it. And Socrates seemed to be associated with those men, put on trial at a time after the war when the Athenian democracy had been restored And the Democrats had said, look, we will hold an amnesty. Anyone who was on the side of the aristocrats and the oligarchs who tried to overthrow democracy, we're not going to talk about it. They actually put in a law, you're not allowed to accuse someone of having been an anti-democrat. But that was how Socrates was seen, and so 3 of his accusers, who were strongly on the Democrat side, brought him to trial not on political charges, since they weren't allowed to, but as I said, on religious charges, not believing in the city's gods, introducing new kinds of gods, and on one which is quasi-political, quasi-sexual, corrupting young men, a kind of moral charge. Now, of course, Socrates did no such thing. He did have a strange voice in his head, which he called his divine sign. So that might have been what his accusers thought gave them grounds for saying he introduced new kinds of God. Because actually it was a strange accusation for a polytheistic society like Athens to say he brought in new gods, because they were always very welcoming to new gods. I mean, let's have more of them. Gods are good for us. But not Socrates' God, because Socrates' God was an individual one. This is a voice he heard and called his divine sign. So maybe that was something that they felt they could accuse him of. And that's what happened. And so he was executed. And that's the one thing most people know. He had to drink a cup of hemlock, of poison, and he died. And so you mentioned, Bijan, you mentioned that satire of Socrates, but there are other satires about the death of Socrates where he's drinking the hemlock and kind of then talking to his friends. I think Steve Martin did one, actually. You can see it on YouTube. So people have ridiculed that scene.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting as well just to listen to the talk about politics at the end of the democratic period and how it collapses. And it's always tempting to have a separate shoot festival event to talk about ancient Greece and the end of democracy. But I mean, just sticking with Socrates, I mean, you lay out this picture of a man in ancient Greece. He's in a succession of thinkers. He's associated with earlier thinkers. He's seems to have some political influence in the city. He gets executed. But what, I mean, brought him out from that to give him his deep fame? I mean, was there a justification for this extraordinary fame he has? Was he truly exceptional? Because people throughout history have spoken about him with the same breath as Jesus. I mean, what really brought him to this?
Well, there are 2 answers. One answer is straightforward. It's Plato. We know about Socrates, and Socrates is hugely famous because Plato wrote 30-odd dialogues. That is, Plato, his pupil, who only knew Socrates when Socrates was an old man, wrote 30 dialogues, beginning with the Apology, which is Socrates' defense speech at his trial. And he puts into Socrates' mouth all the philosophy that, in a way, underpins the whole of the Western philosophical tradition. So, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, all those things, all those areas of philosophy which Plato covers in these vast and brilliant dialogues are all put into the mouth of Socrates. And that's why Socrates is so famous. In the same way as you rightly make the comparison with Jesus. Jesus wrote nothing, but he was known because St. Paul preached Jesus as God, and he wrote his letters and his Acts of the Apostles and so on. So Plato is one answer to why Socrates is so famous. The question, does he deserve to be? Well, a lot of the ideas in Plato seem to be Plato's own, but that is, there's a general idea that a lot of the early dialogues represent what Socrates himself did and thought, and the later dialogues give us a philosophy that we can ascribe to Plato rather than to Socrates, even though they're put into Socrates' mouth. So what is the thing for which Socrates is famous? Well, perhaps the main thing that Cicero, the Roman statesman, thought he should be known for was turning philosophy from what I had mentioned before, the physical nature of the universe, to how human beings should act and think. As Cicero said, he brought philosophy down from the heavens to earth. So that's the first thing. He seems to have been responsible for a pretty wholesale shift in what philosophy is about. So philosophy is about wonder about the world. I mean, this is, what sort of world do we live in? Socrates realized, according to Plato, quite soon that the answers were not forthcoming. And actually, he was right. It took 2,500 years before modern science started to give us the answer to physics and biology and so on. But in Socrates' time, you just didn't have a clue how to set about these things. There was no tradition of experimental science. So he gave all that up. He said, look, we can't really ever know those things, or not yet anyway. What we can ask is, how should we behave? Why should we be courageous, for example? Why should we want knowledge? How do I know what I know? What is love? I mean, that's an interesting question. We all have experience of love, but what is it actually? And so those sorts of questions, those ethical questions, questions about human life, were the things that Socrates concentrated on. And that is one of the reasons why people think we should attribute to Socrates some fundamental change in the nature of the tradition thus far. The answers that Socrates came up with were provisional. So this is his other, in a way, enormous contribution. It is that you don't necessarily come to a full stop. So many of the other philosophers that he would have experienced said, this is the answer. The world consists of water or air or fire. So he says, we are not even looking at those questions. We're looking at questions about, courage and love and wisdom and truth. And the answers are not to be found. We are only questioners. So the unexamined life is not worth living sums up this idea. You have to keep examining. Life is about examining and not being content with an answer that appears to present itself as the truth. Strip away all the falsehoods and you're getting closer to the truth. You'll never actually get there in your lifetime. And that's, I think, a very almost postmodern way of thinking. It's something people are not very happy with, that life gives us the opportunity to think and to question, but not necessarily to come to a clear and determinate answer to anything.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things about this is that, putting forward this new approach is that, as you said, he didn't write anything down, or at least, he might have written a hymn or two, but we don't, of course, have any of that. A lot of it comes from the way that he lived his life and interacted with the people around him, as we see in Plato's dialogues. Can you tell us a bit about how those interactions and the way he lived his life showed this new approach?
So Socrates was known as a questioner, in fact, a somewhat irritating questioner. He spent much of his later life, at any rate, walking around Athens, rarely leaving the city, and subjecting people of high and low ranks to questioning. So that was his method. In Greek, it's called the elenchus, subjecting someone to a questioning, examination. And the purpose of this questioning was to see if they had unexamined assumptions, which, when put to the test, would show that actually they were believing in something that was really inadequate. So that's what we get in the early Platonic dialogues in particular. Socrates posing questions like, what is virtue or what is holiness, and getting an answer from someone who he happens to bump into or he's met at a particular occasion, at a meeting in a philosopher's house, and asking the question, what is it? And he usually uses a general term like courage, beauty, truth, or love. And that's, according to Aristotle, was his other enormous contribution, that he worked on the level of generality, of abstraction, as opposed to just looking for individual answers. So he didn't say, tell me what an act of courage is, and then somebody say, oh, it's, dashing into battle and saving someone from the teeth of the enemy. He said, yeah, but that's an example. But what I want to know is, what is courage itself? Can we define the thing itself? And then someone will come up with a definition. Say courage is, not feeling any fear. And he'll say, but if you don't feel any fear, you can't be commended for doing something courageous, can you? So surely courage has to involve feeling the fear of it, doing it anyway, to use the title of a well-known pop psychology book. Feel the fear of it. Well, that is what Socrates says, because he has then stripped away this false notion from his interlocutor that you can be courageous simply by being fearless, and he says, no, it can't be the case. So you start to get a sense of why this question and answer method brings us closer to some kind of truth. But it's essentially what you might call a negative method. It's not telling us, look, this is the answer. It's saying, well, we know there is one. There is such a thing as courage, but we don't know what it is. But it's not that, or at least it's that qualified. It's not this, it's this qualified, and so on. So the questioning method, this is key. I actually think this is an amazingly important thing, because the fact is, we present knowledge, teachers present knowledge as if it's known, as if there is no change. Someone said in the chat, I've noticed, is his thinking is universal and unchanging? No, that's not the point. If he had a universal, unchanging thought as such, then that wouldn't be Socratic. The point about Socrates, and indeed it goes back to his not writing anything down, he says in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, writing is bad because once it's written, you can't change it. You ask it a question, it's not going to respond and change its mind. So it's very important for Socrates that you have live dialogue and that you can change your mind as you go.
It's a very worrying thought for writers, but great for literary festivals where we talk about books instead of reading them. But the way he lived his life is very important, and this starts to bring us towards the substance of your book. He doesn't write anything down, and you've mentioned Plato and Plato's dialogues, where Socrates appears as a character as one of the sources. What other sources do we have for his life and understanding how he comes to these insights and to have this profound effect on later thinking?
So there are other sources, other contemporary sources which talk about Socrates. I mentioned one source which was slightly later, not contemporary, who talks about Socrates in his early life having an older philosopher as a lover. A kind of shocking thing for some biographers of Socrates who just dismissed it. I mean, it's hardly ever brought up at all as a serious piece of information. And even if it is brought up, people say, well, okay, well, Socrates in his youth, we don't know anything about his youth. But the fact is that these other sources, Plato, of course, is the major source. He gives us the most writing about Socrates. Other sources, Xenophon, who is a soldier and a follower of Socrates and a thinker, writes an awful lot about Socrates, but it happens to be roughly the same age as Plato. In other words, someone who only knew Socrates when Socrates was 60 or older. So the two major sources, Plato and Xenophon, are both talking about Socrates as an older man, a man who died when they were in their 20s, who was put on trial and put to death. What they preserve are some indications of what he was like as a younger man, and I mined their texts for those indications, and there are quite a few. And then there are what some would call minor sources, and they are contemporary, but contemporary with Socrates when he was a bit younger. So one of them is Aristophanes, the comic playwright, who writes a whole play produced in 423 BC, when Socrates was in his been in his 40s then. In that play, Socrates is the central character, and he's made a lot of fun of because he's portrayed as this teacher of false argumentation, and he does all kinds of weird experiments, and he's highfalutin talker, but also his image is one of a barefoot, emaciated thinker. So what can we get out of that? Well, it's obviously meant to be funny. The kind of thing that Socrates subjects his pupils to can't be taken seriously, but it is a question and answer routine. So Aristophanes knew that much about Socrates. He also knew that he was poor, because that's how he portrays him. Socrates actually decided to jettison all material wealth and comfort in order to follow what became his calling, that is finding out the truth. So as well as that, we can go back further and find other sources. There's a man called Ion of Chios who we have a snippet of information from him, which is reported by a later source. So a lot of the information about the younger Socrates is picked up by sources later. I mentioned Cicero, for example. Cicero read a book in which Socrates figured, and he quotes it. We don't have that book, but it is contemporary with Socrates. So those kinds of sources picked up by later authors like Diogenes Laertius, who wrote Lives of the Philosophers, in the early centuries of the Christian era. Those things I thought were worth having a look at, because they do actually give us a different picture, but actually a picture that somewhat gels with elements of the picture that Plato and Xenophon give us. I'll give you an example. Plato, in at least 2 dialogues, possibly 3, has Socrates looking at a young man with lust and saying something like, I'm burning with lust because I saw that man's tunic drop from his shoulders and I saw his bare breasts. So even Plato gives us a hint that Socrates was a lusty man in his older age and certainly had homoerotic feelings, even if Plato also tells us that he was married and he had 3 children, and that he also, Xenophon tells us, for example, that he was an admirer of a particular woman's form who was painted by a contemporary painter. So we have lots of different information, quite a lot of it, pointing to Socrates being a lusty man in his older age. In his old age, he was said to have married Xantippe and had 3 children. So that implies that there was a certain lustiness about him, a sexual vigour. But that seems to come across a lot. And that is then backed up by some of these later sources. Some of whom say that Socrates was wildly immoral when he was a young man, but he changed after he met the philosopher Archelaus, and then he became much more sober in his 20s. Now, why should we believe that? That's from a much later bishop who writes about Socrates. He seems to have picked it up from some source earlier than him. He doesn't tell us who it is. So these are the kinds of things I thought, well, we can start putting them together. The so-called important central sources, Plato and Xenophon, what they say about his youth, but also what we can pick up from some of these minor sources. And that's when I started wondering whether Socrates' youth could explain to us why he became the person he did in his older age. And I think the answer is that we can probably find some contours of Socratic thinking in his younger age, which led to the kind of Socrates that we are familiar with in his older age.
Yeah, so the whole point of your book is that you've sort of looked rather harder at some of the sources which have been rather left to one side. Lots of people who have looked at Socrates have only thought about this portrayal of the older man, but you've started to ask the question, what was he as a younger man? How did his approach develop, and what sort of life did he lead, and how did that life in his earlier time affect his later life? And one of the major things that you identify is the role that a particular woman played in the development of his life, his character, and his thoughts. He was very much tended, certainly in sort of recent decades, to have been entirely left out of the equation. This is Aspasia of Miletus. And can you tell us how Aspasia, why was she so important in her own right? She was a very important woman in ancient Athens. And why was she so important to Socrates? What was her impact on him? I think you're still muted up.
Sorry. Yes. Well, this in a way is a big revelation, because any classical historian knows quite a lot, or they think they know quite a lot about Aspasia of Miletus. Aspasia, this woman who came from the city which I mentioned earlier, was one of the centres of philosophical thinking in the generations prior to Socrates. In that city was born a woman called Aspasia in Greek, and she emigrated to Athens, which was, as I said, the centre of the Greek world after the Persian Wars, from Miletus when she was about 20. 5 years later, age 25, she moved in with, was partner and companion of, and possibly was married to, I think she was actually married to, the source is not clear, Pericles, who was the leading citizen of Athens, the man who for 30 years dominated the political scene, and who, from all the sources, we're told, absolutely adored Aspasia, respected her, treated her like no Athenian treated their wife, because Athenian wives on the whole tended to be married very young, 13 or 14. They were kept in the home, they were homemakers, and Athenian men went out and conquered the world and thought about things and wrote books, but they didn't give much time to their women folk. Aspasia was totally different. She was the most unusual woman in antiquity, and she was, as I say, the partner or wife of the leading citizen in Athens for about 15 years when Athens' empire was at its peak. So she was known to be influential. In fact, Plato writes a dialogue called the Menexenus in which she is said to have written the so-called funeral speech of Pericles. So Pericles gave a funeral speech at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, and he gave this speech, which was said to have been drafted for him, or written indeed for him, by Aspasia. Excuse me a second. So this is something that I thought, well, this influential woman in Pericles' circle is likely to have come across Socrates, because Socrates was also in Pericles' circle. And we know this from all the sources. We know that Socrates' greatest friend in his later age, in his middle age, was a young man called Alcibiades, who was the ward of Pericles of Athens, someone who Pericles had taken over as guardian when Alcibiades' father died in war, when Alcibiades was 4 or 5. And then Alcibiades is sent to Socrates to be his teacher and mentor, and they actually share a tent when Alcibiades is 19 or 20 and Socrates is in his 30s on a campaign in northern Greece. So given this very close connection between the ward of Pericles and Socrates, and there are lots of other connections too, it seemed to me that Socrates was in that circle from a very early age, and he is bound to have bumped into Aspasia. So why aren't we told about it? We are shown in the Menexenus, which I'd mentioned as the dialogue in which Aspasia is said to have written the speech of Pericles, that Socrates is familiar with her. We're shown that, but we don't know when that is. That could have been when they're older. But what I found was Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, in which Socrates and other men discuss the topic of love. And in that dialogue, he says, I know one thing, he says, I know the truth about love, and I'm going to tell it to you. Now, this is a very strange statement from someone whose claim to fame was that he knows nothing. He says, the one thing I know is I know nothing. But in the Symposium, he says, but I can tell you the truth about love, which means he knows about love. And he says, I can tell you the truth about it because I learned it from a very clever woman. Well, there are not a lot of clever women in Athens at that time, as far as one knows from the other sources. But he says this clever woman, her name was Diotima. Now, everybody has said, well, okay, so there were two clever women. There was Aspasia and there was this Diotima, but we know nothing else about her apart from what's in this dialogue. and her name means honoured by Zeus. Diotima in Greek is what it means, given honour by Zeus, the chief of the gods. And at some stage I had a brainwave. I thought it was a sort of moment of enlightenment, because Zeus, the chief of the gods, was the name given to Pericles by all the comic poets. And as we are told, Pericles honoured Aspasia more than any Athenian had honoured a woman ever. So honoured by Zeus seemed to me to be a clue that this woman, who Socrates says taught him all about love, was indeed Aspasia, even though under a nickname of Diotima in Plato's dialogue. And that was then reinforced by an extraordinary bit of detail that Plato gives us when Socrates says, I was taught the truth about love by this clever woman who managed to postpone the Athenian plague by 10 years when the Athenians were sacrificing to ward it off. I thought, what is this? I looked in the commentaries, nobody explained it satisfactorily. Why was the plague at Athens? We know when it happened, 430 to 29. Why was that supposed to have been warded off and by someone arranging sacrifices for 10 years? And so I thought, well, what happened 10 years earlier? And the answer was very clear, and all, again, ancient historians immediately will recognize that in 440 to 439 BC, Pericles conducted a campaign against the island of Samos. And in that campaign, he eventually won, and he had the commanders of the other side crucified and strung up and thrown out without their bodies thrown out without burial. And this is a kind of religious crime that you would have expected to call down the retribution of the gods. So Sophocles' Antigone, a play was written about the same time. The unburied body, even of an enemy, is going to cause problems for a whole community. But there wasn't a plague in 440 to 439. And actually Pericles appeared to have got away with this act of brutality scot-free until 10 years later. And then there was a plague. A lot of Athenians, a third of Athens, died from that plague, and Pericles died from that plague. And so I realized that what Plato was hinting at was that somebody 10 years earlier had arranged for sacrifices in order to try and atone for what Pericles had done. And it seemed to me there was only one person in the frame who could have done that, who was interested in saying to Pericles, look, we've got to atone. Everyone's telling us that there's going to be a plague because of your behavior. Let's arrange for sacrifices to the gods and expiate this crime. She did so, this clever woman called Diotima, and there was no plague, at least for 10 years. Then there was a plague, and people must have said, oh, she delayed it. She didn't actually avert it forever. But 10 years later, the plague that was due to afflict Athens and Pericles happened. So it seemed to me that the person in the frame of doing that was Aspasia and no one else. And she is the only clever woman. And since we know nothing else about Diotima, apart from what we read in the Symposium, it struck me that if there was a real person behind the scenes who Socrates could say, she taught me about love, it was Aspasia. And then this secondary source comes into play. Cicero tells us he had read a book written by a contemporary called Aeschines, a contemporary of Socrates, and that book was called Aspasia. And it was about how Aspasia used to hold salons in which she lectured to Athenians, elite Athenians, including Socrates, about love and marriage. And it's often been dismissed. She was a kind of marriage counsellor. But it seemed to me that the fact that this was somebody talking about love to elite Athenians, including Socrates, makes it very obvious to me that the Diotima who is talking about love to Socrates in the Symposium is at least modelled on Aspasia of Miletus. And therefore that we can perhaps learn something about that, about the fact that Socrates listened to somebody, and that person was Aspasia when he was young, and possibly loved this woman, because there is another minor source which says that before she was with Pericles, Aspasia was with Socrates. It's a bit vague about what was with, but I thought, well, this source, which is a pupil of Aristotle, Clearchus, he tells us this. He thought that whatever Aspasia did with Pericles, she had previously done with Socrates. So let's say they were lovers. So this is how I felt I could bring together the evidence to suggest that this woman, Aspasia, was very influential, because actually if you read the Symposium, one or two of the things that Diotima tells Socrates about love that he then reports as having learned from her are precisely the things we learn about Socrates' own method. The move from the particular to the general, and the desire for definition. What is love? Two things which Aristotle tells us are the key contributions to thinking of Socrates himself, are what he tells us Diotima taught him. So if she's a real woman, Aspasia should be attributed with some of the fundamental ideas of Socratic thinking and method.
So, I mean, we've got this extraordinary picture. We've got the detective work where you sort of pull this connection together. And in what's a very male-dominated world, a very sort of male-dominated world of thinkers exchanging ideas, there's actually a woman at the heart of Socrates' thought. I mean, starting to prompt it on. And I mean, can you tell us a bit more about how you think she might have influenced the way that his thought developed, and how practically that took place?
I think that's a very difficult question to ask. You know, to try and reconstruct the details is impossible and is bound to be speculative. If it's true that Socrates as a young man encountered Aspasia, and I think all the circumstantial evidence suggests that it is, if it's true that Aspasia was a very clever woman who was to some extent a teacher of people like Pericles and Socrates, and again all the evidence points to that, Plato's Menexenus and the Symposium, if my identification holds up. If all that is true, then something that Aspasia did is likely, in my view, to have influenced Socrates. Now, it could have been something that she said and thought. It could have been something in his personal experience of her. So, as I say, it's speculative. In my book, I talk about how it would have been very difficult to create a film about Socrates, because the Socrates we know, the older man, as a philosopher, never really changes. Whereas if we think about him as a young man in a highly militaristic world, growing up as a soldier, and we know he was a very effective and constantly in service, he was an effective soldier. How does that person change into a thinker? Well, it's a personal life change, isn't it? And so it may have involved taking Clearchus's evidence seriously, that he was in love with or a lover of Aspasia, and then she left him for Pericles, because, as I say, she came to Athens at the age of 20. By the age of 25, she was with Pericles, leading citizen. There was a 5-year window in which she and Socrates were roughly the same age, in their early 20s, and were likely to have met because they were both in Pericles' circle. So at the age of 25, she goes off with this incredibly important, influential man who is twice as old as her. Pericles was 50 when he married this 25-year-old Aspasia. So I think perhaps more in terms of expanding that speculation into a kind of film script in which you have these two young people, both very strange, both very clever, Aspasia and Socrates, and she essentially leaves him for this older, more influential man. And if you read the story of love, the doctrine of love given to Socrates by Diotima in the Symposium, it's about how love shouldn't be about personal attraction and relationships. It should go beyond that. It should be higher than that. It should transcend sexual attraction and individual relationships. That is what her doctrine is. Well, as I've often said, it's one way of letting down your lover gently. You know, love isn't just about sexual attraction and individual relations. It's about higher things. And what are the higher things for Aspasia? Well, one of the higher things is love of the city, love of Athens, love of her beloved Pericles, leader of that city. And the evidence for that is in Pericles' funeral speech, where he actually uses the word to the citizens of Athens: you should be lovers, erastai, of your city. So it's as if that is endorsed by Aspasia's idea that love is a higher thing than individual attraction. And of course, Plato or Socrates takes it further and talks about love transcending it. It's actually where we get our idea of platonic love, the kind of love that doesn't require a sexual relationship. But that's because it's taken from Plato's account of the story of Socrates learning this from Diotima. So I don't know the answer to what actually happens, but I think that, one could perhaps speculate that something in Socrates' personal life or in his intellectual life was changed by his meeting this extraordinary woman.
We've got some questions coming in from the chat box and also in the question and answer box. I'll take some of them now. Elise asks, how might Aspasia have come by such sophisticated knowledge or education?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question, because it was most unusual in ancient Athens for women to be educated. As I said, they would have been betrothed and married at a very young age, and they were expected to basically be housekeepers. But Aspasia was not brought up in Athens, she was brought up in Miletus. And we do know that other city-states, such as Miletus and indeed Sparta, had very different attitudes towards women. In Sparta, they could fight, they could be gymnastically excellent. In Miletus, it seems that they could be educated. They could get some kind of education that enabled them to work on the same level as men intellectually. And one of the proofs of that is that a lot of the people who came to Athens, the women who came to Athens from Miletus, were so-called courtesans, hetairae, in ancient terminology. They were known to be a particular high-class kind of sex worker who the men enjoyed the company of, because these people were clever, they were talented. Some of them were musicians, for example. They could play the double pipes, the aulos, beautifully. And no doubt they could hold their own in conversation with men in a way that freeborn Athenian women were not even expected to. So because of that connection, Aspasia has been often called, at least in modern times, a hetaira. Because people thought, well, how could this woman have come to Athens and held her own with men in the way that we're told she did? Surely she had to be one of these courtesans, a paid consort of elite men. Well, that is what most people believe about Aspasia. In fact, if you look up most books about the ancient world in which she's mentioned, or look up at the Wikipedia article, which I haven't yet got to change, because I like to see this thing, it says Aspasia is hetaira. She was a courtesan. There is no single ancient source which tells us that. What the ancient sources tell us are two things. On the one side, there's Plato and Xenophon, who talk about Aspasia in very respectable terms as a teacher, an instructor of ideas and of speeches and eloquence. On the other side, there are comic poets, the tabloid journalists of their day, who like to rake all the muck. And what they say is not that she was an upper-class courtesan at all, but that she was a porne, which in Greek means a prostitute. She was a common prostitute, according to the comic poets. And not only that, she ran a brothel, and amongst other things, she brought freeborn women for Pericles to enjoy. So she was a pimp and a prostitute. Now, these comic poets are having a go at Pericles by attacking Aspasia, his beloved wife. And that was something that the comic poets did. They were like review artists, they were highly satirical, they were spitting image. And this is what they do with their targets. They call them all sorts of terrible names. And we are told that Pericles brought in the first censorship law in 440 BC, which tried to shut them down. So we can imagine why. I mean, they were very insulting towards his beloved Aspasia, apart from anything else. It didn't last. He had to repeal that law within a few years, partly because comic poetry was meant to be slanderous and full of humorous invective. But I think that the question which asks us, how did she come by it? Well, she came by it in Miletus. She wouldn't have been the only one to be an educated woman, but she's the only one we know about, because her status was that of the the companion of the leading man of Athens for a very long period, a period in which she bore a son, and that son, Pericles Jr., under Pericles' own law, from before meeting Aspasia, would have to be illegitimate, the child of an Athenian citizen and a non-Athenian mother. He pleaded, and we're told about this, he pleaded to make his son from Aspasia legitimate. And the Athenian assembly, which was the organ of democratic choice and decision, agreed, unusually. So I think there are a lot of unusual things about Aspasia, and not least that she was an educated woman who actually could make her mark in Athenian society.
We've got time just to pick up on a couple more of the audience questions. Annie Freud asks, do you think that Socrates' popularity is to do with his reputation for valuing his thoughts above his status?
I think that's a very good way of putting it. Socrates believed that it was his mission to pursue wisdom. So in Greek, the word philosophos, a philosopher, is someone who loves, philo, wisdom, sophia. That is what philosophia is, the love of wisdom, and love is a pursuit. So the whole point of the symposium is that love is not something that you actually simply possess. It's something you want to possess, something that you pursue and you want to possess forever. And that is the pursuit of wisdom was Socrates' eternal quest. I'm looking for the answers. I may never be a sophos, a wise man, someone who has the answers, but I will always be a philosophos, someone who loves the wisdom that I want to attain. So that was his mission, and he said he was given a divine sign to follow that. His friends had gone to the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle had said, there is no man wiser than Socrates. Socrates thought, this is ridiculous. I can't be the cleverest man in Greece. Went around asking questions, realized the only reason he said I'm cleverer is because I know that I know nothing. So he recognized that that was his calling, to persuade other people that what we think we know we don't, and that is the way to wisdom, to knowledge. You know, we may not get there, but you will be pursuing it. And in order to do that, he said, he chose poverty. This is someone who grew up, was able to be a hoplite soldier all his life, therefore had a certain property qualification, but was never going to make money out of his teachings, which he could have done. A lot of the other so-called sophists, the professors of wisdom, did so. Socrates chose not to take any money. He chose to fight barefoot. He chose to wear rags, and the only thing he had in his life that he maintained was his panoply, his suit of armor, because he knew he'd have to fight from time to time. But basically, he wasn't interested in material wealth. There's a wonderful saying of his from a later source which says he looked at the agora, at all the things on sale in the marketplace, and said, all those wonderful things which I don't want. So he was interested only, as you say, in his thinking. He put that status of himself as a philosopher above his status as someone seeking fame, seeking material wealth, seeking anything but knowledge. So I think that's right.
I'm going to bring together two questions just to round off our time here. Christina Lamb asks, well, when I studied PPE 30 years ago, we didn't study a single woman. Has that changed? I mean, we certainly think about that in the classics, and thinking about how you're putting Aspasia at the heart of your work on Socrates. And Victoria also asked, did you think about calling your book Socrates on Love instead of as well as in love?
Well, as to the first question, yes, things have changed, and I was part of a conference in February of last year, just before the plague struck, which was about women intellectuals in the ancient world. And there were at least a dozen different names. A lot of you would have heard of Hypatia of Alexandria, the mathematician, because of the film that was made with Rachel Weisz. But there were others, Perictione, there were other names that have rarely been heard about, Theano, wife of Pythagoras, that people talked about. And of course there are women, and there are some names. Unfortunately, evidence for their thinking and their conduct and so on is very thin on the ground on the whole. If I'm right about identifying Diotima with Aspasia, then I think we have got quite a lot more about Aspasia than we do about any ancient woman from that period. So I hope that at least some of women's contribution to philosophy and thinking will increasingly become part of what you might call the curriculum. Socrates on love. Well, I frankly thought of different titles. My original title was Young Socrates, because that's what I thought I was writing about. And it was in the course of the research that I, as I said, had that sudden brainwave that actually Diotima can't be this fictional person called honoured by Zeus. She must actually be a real woman. And then I found the source, Clearchus, saying that Socrates had been in love with her before Pericles. And I thought, well, that's enough for me to call it Socrates in Love, which of course reminds us of that wonderful film Shakespeare in Love. And I wanted that to evoke Shakespeare in Love, because Shakespeare in Love is very clever. It takes out of Shakespeare's writings, Tom Stoppard did a wonderful job, makes a semi-humorous, obviously fictional story about Shakespeare in love. And I think in the end, unfortunately, the evidence is not sufficiently detailed for us to actually write about Socrates' youth without speculating in the way that I have done. And so Socrates in Love seemed to me the ideal title, because it evoked the idea that what I'm going to say uses the evidence, is compatible with the evidence, but cannot simply be called the answer to Socrates' life. So rather like Socrates himself, I'll always be looking for the answer, but I'll never be sure I've actually got it.
I think that's a wonderful way to round everything off. We're like Socrates, always going to be asking about Socrates as well as wisdom. It feels like the hour has shot past. There's still very many questions that I'd like to ask about your book, and it just shows how rich the book is, and how exciting it is to see the sort of changes and developments that there are in the classical world. Say at Oxford, you're getting people to speak Latin again. You're helping to put sort of women back in the frame of the classics as well. So I heartily recommend Armand's book. You can click on the link if you scroll up the chat box to buy it from our local independent bookshop. They'll deliver anywhere in the country. Again, just huge thanks to Armand for a really fascinating evening discussing Socrates. So thank you, Armand, for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation, and always a pleasure to talk about this fascinating subject. I hope some of you have enjoyed it and will enjoy the book too.
Thank you. And the next Shoot Festival event will be on Thursday, the 11th of March, again at 6 p.m. And we're going to have something a little bit different. We're going to have two crime novelists in conversation. We're going to have Jason Webster, who's a Shoot Festival regular, in conversation with Lawrence Anhalt. And Lawrence is going to be talking about his crime detective series, Festival of Death, with his lead character, who was a Buddhist detective in Lyme Regis, which may be quite Socratic in some way, I don't know. But again, huge thanks to all of you for joining us. Lots of lovely questions. Thanks to Armand again, and we very much look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much for being with us. See you next time.